Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar entitled Optimizing Cover Crop Mixes for Soil Health and Nutrient Retention. My name is Anna Gridjonsdottir, and I'm the project coordinator at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, who is hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by my colleague, Dr. Thomas Green, president and co-founder of the IPM Institute, who will provide a brief introduction. I am also pleased to welcome our guest speaker. Today we will hear from Mitch Hunter, Ph.D. candidate in agronomy at Penn State University. Due to a family emergency, Dr. Charlie White is unable to join us this morning, but Mitch has graciously offered to present on his behalf. We wish Charlie's family the best. At the end of this presentation, we will use the remaining time for Q&A. Before we begin, I want to share some brief logistics. You will remain muted as an audience member during the presentations, but please make use of the question box on your screen to type questions for Mitch. I will moderate the questions at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on partnershipfarm.org. By attending the webinar today, you will be eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 0.5 for crop management, 0.5 for soil and water management, and 0.5 for nutrient management. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive those points. If you are watching this webinar live, you will receive an email by the end of the day with the webinar recording and a link to submit survey evaluations. A link and pop-up question will be provided at the end of this webinar to submit CCA credentials to earn points if you have not already done so. If you are watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch through the Citrix platform and not YouTube to receive credit. A link to register on Citrix will be provided in the text below the YouTube video recording, or it will be emailed to you if you have already registered for this webinar. You are provided instructions at the end of this presentation to submit your credentials. And now with logistics taken care of, I will turn it over to Dr. Thomas Green.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everybody for joining us. The Partnership for Ag Resource Management is an effort of our nonprofit IPM Institute, along with our many other projects in agriculture and communities, each focused on using the power of the marketplace to improve sustainability. Our team of 21 is currently working to increase adoption of best practices and improve outcomes in health, environment, and economics, all key elements of sustainability. We write regularly on IPM and other topics for Crops and Soils magazine. Our article on the revised worker protection standard is in the latest issue. We also work with pest control companies, hospitals, schools, and other facilities in communities, and with food companies and farmers around the world to improve practices and performance, and to communicate those benefits to buyers and the public. Our goal with the Partnership for Ag Resource Management is to identify revenue opportunities for ag retailers that help keep our valuable ag resources on cropland, help to promote those products and services, and track and report sales and estimated reductions in losses of nutrients and other inputs. So we focused on phosphorus losses to date, particularly in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So these photos show what happens when too much phosphorus gets in the water, feeding blooms of algae, which close beaches to swimming, make fishing a challenge, and have also shut down public water supplies. The graph on the left shows NOAA annual data on algal bloom severity since 2002. After phosphorus loadings declined sharply in the mid-'80s with the advent of reduced tillage, they've increased. And as a result, we've experienced more frequent and severe algal blooms. 2015 was a record, and about at 10.5, 2016 was about a third of the 2015 levels. So we know that phosphorus is coming primarily from cropland because of the timing of the loads. They spike during snowmelt and rain events in winter and early spring following fall applications. And weather has a lot to do with the peaks and the valleys in the pattern that you see here.
So this slide here shows algal blooms since 2002 in Western Lake Erie Basin. And we've been focusing on phosphorus loss reduction there, because as you can see from the pictures, it really makes fishing a challenge, results in beach closings, and has closed public water supplies as well. 2015 was a record year. Last year, about a third of that. We know that the phosphorus is coming from cropland because of the timing of the loading. during snowmelt events and spring rains after fall applications. So ag retailers have valuable products and services that help to reduce phosphorus losses from cropland, and here's a list of them, along with very rough estimates of how much they reduce phosphorus loss. So cover crops that we'll be hearing about today reduce phosphorus loss by an average of 0.63 pounds per acre based on published studies from around the U.S. Applying at extension recommendations and soil testing, variable rate phosphorus applications, custom banding, applying in the rooting zone, notifying farmers after applications to lightly incorporate phosphorus, and applying for the following crop only are some of the things that ag retailers can do to address this issue. And ag retailers are making a difference. So these are survey data from products and services trends in the Sandusky River watershed since 2012, and you can see that sales of variable rate have increased from 17% of acres serviced by ag retailers in the watershed to 70% this last year. Quite an accomplishment. So in 2015, we were able to obtain funding from EPA and other sources to offer ag retailers an opportunity to provide free VRT acres to farmers who hadn't tried it before. And we've had nearly 40 ag retailers participate and over 100 growers who are new to VRT try that practice. So we've also been promoting VRT and other products and services through some tools that Anna will share with you later on in the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anna to take it from here.
Thanks, Tom. As Tom mentioned, we do have some free resources available on our website, partnershipfarm.org. On the left, you can see the front page of our agronomist handbook that is available free for download. On the right, you can see the front and back of our phosphorus loss reduction wallet card, which can be ordered for free on our website as well. These serve as a great conversation starter with your growers. Lots of people order them and take them to their various meetings. To date, we have distributed more than 20,000 wallet cards. Our next webinar is July 25th, and we will be covering the topic of cover crop seeding. So mark your calendars for that. And thanks to funding from the EPA Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we are now enrolling growers in the Sandusky, Cedar Portage, Lower Maumee, and Blanchard watersheds in Ohio for our latest VRT cost share program. If you are interested in learning more about VRT or possibly getting involved with the program, please contact Mark Adelsberger for more information at mark@partnershipfarm.org. We invite you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for PARM updates and industry news after the webinar. Now we'll hear from Mitch Hunter. Mitch is a Ph.D. candidate in agronomy at Penn State University.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here on speaking to you all over this webinar. I'm glad you could all join us. And I'm going to be talking about optimizing cover crop seed mixes for soil health and nutrient retention. Again, my name is Mitch Hunter. Let me get there we go. My name is Mitch Hunter. I'm a PhD candidate in agronomy here at Penn State. And I've been working with cover crop mixes in a research project here for about 5 years, and also, following the literature. And so I'm happy to be able to share what I've learned. I want to say first, many thanks to Charlie White. He wasn't able to be here today, but a lot of this work reflects, a lot of what I'm going to share reflects his work. He's now a research associate here at Penn State, previously a graduate student, and also the Northeast SARE coordinator here at Penn State. So many thanks to Charlie, and also many thanks to the whole Cover Crop Cocktails project team. That's the name of the project that I've done most of my work in. It's a big team. We have soil scientists, entomologists, agronomists, weed scientists. We have researchers, extensionists. We have cooperating farmers and others in the region who give us input. So this wouldn't be possible without them, and I just want to thank all of them, and also share that there's a lot of brains going into what I'm going to share today. So the big question in my mind that I want to address is why mixtures? Why are we thinking about planting cover crop mixtures? Mixtures are really hot right now, very popular, lots of interest from farmers, and that is awesome. There's nothing better than something that gets farmers fired up to try something new that can have so many benefits for them, for their soil, for the environment, kind of across the board. But cover crops, single species cover crops are great as well. So why mixtures? And to my mind, the main reason is that mixing species can diversify the benefits that a cover crop provides. All cover crops provide a range of benefits, and we'll talk about that in a second. But mixtures have the ability, we see from our results, to diversify the benefits that you get. So you get a broader suite of benefits from those cover crops. And let me tell you, illustrate what I mean from that. Anytime that you plant a cover crop, you're doing this balancing act of different benefits. So for instance, you want to think about the yield of the next cash crop. Maybe they're controlling weeds. Importantly, for this group, they can retain nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus. They can also supply nitrogen to the following cash crop. They can improve the soil ecology and biology, add soil organic matter, reduce erosion, a wide range of things. And this is true of even individual species. A single species cover crop is doing multiple things for you. But that means that you need to balance those things. Which ones do you want? Which ones are priorities? And how do you get the benefits that you're shooting for? So I'm going to use this kind of image a few times, so I want to explain it. We call this a spider plot. And basically the way it works is that for each of these different axes, soil organic matter, yield, etc., we take measurements, and then each treatment gets a score. So a reading that's close to the center of this, for instance, this yield reading, that's bad. If it were way out here, that'd be good. So this organic matter reading out here is good. And it's just kind of a quick way of looking at a suite of different benefits and can help think about this balancing act. So to give you more concrete examples, here's data from our study. And don't take this to be exactly what you'd find on your farm. Every farm is different, and the management can change pretty drastically, but it's a good illustration. So on the left, we see the effects of having a rye cover crop on the system and the following corn crop. And you can see that it's really spiky. You've got pretty good readings left to right, bad readings top to bottom. And this rye did great for adding organic matter to the soil, for controlling weeds, for retaining nitrogen, but did a bad job in terms of promoting the yield of the next crop and supplying nitrogen to the next crop. Now, the Austrian winter pea did pretty much exactly the opposite. Great for yield, great for nitrogen supply, but pretty poor as far as adding organic matter, and pretty poor for weed control, nitrogen retention, soil biology. So what we see here is that we have these two single species cover crops, and they're giving us an imbalanced set of benefits. A lot of some things and not a lot of other things. And the question with mixtures is what happens when you put those multiple species together. When you overlay the benefits of one with the other, what happens? And we just so happened to have a treatment that included rye and pea. It also had red clover, but really rye and pea were doing most of the work. And what we saw is that putting those multiple species together gave us the diverse benefits that I was talking about in the beginning. So the shape is broader, it's more balanced, you're still getting really good inputs to soil organic matter, for nitrogen retention, for weed control, but you're gaining, by having the pea in the mix, you're gaining a lot better yield, you're gaining a lot better nitrogen supply. So in this case, putting together a diverse mix with multiple species gives you a more balanced and diverse set of benefits. And that can be really great if that's your goal. Sometimes what you want is a cover crop that's going to produce as much biomass as possible. And in that case, if you have kind of one goal, it may be better to go with one species that you can rely on. Cereal rye, in that case, would be a great for a little bit of insurance, but you're not aiming to balance the benefits. But I think a lot of times in agriculture, we are balancing between getting the yield that we want and also retaining nitrogen, between getting a lot of inputs to soil organic matter and also supplying nitrogen to the following crop. And in those cases, having these mixtures can be a tool to balance your benefits. So that brings us to the question of how do we make a mixture? And I'm going to give you the short version. If you want the full version, you can go to the fact sheet, Penn State Extension fact sheet that I and my colleagues put together. Charlie White led this process. It's called Making the Most of Mixtures. So if you Google that, Making the Most of Mixtures, Penn State, you'll come up and you can either order copies or do a free download of the PDF. There's also a link down there at the bottom of your screen. And the short version of how to make a mixture, I'll go through this in detail, but first you need to identify your goals. What are you trying to get out of your cover crops? You need to pick cover crop species that can meet these goals based on their characteristics. And a critical thing is to account for the planting window of your cover crop. So if you're in the upper Midwest going in after corn grain or soybean, you're going to be planting pretty late unless you get creative with one of the new ways of interseeding or overseeding that are coming online. So you've got a limited planting window to work with, and you really need to account for that, or you might be putting seed out there and paying for that seed that's just not going to grow. Finally, probably the biggest challenge is picking a seeding rate that accounts for interactions between the species in the mix. An important one there is dominance. So I'll show some examples later, especially grasses and brassicas. Okay, so this is the outline of how to make a mixture. Let's go into greater detail. First step is identifying your goals, and remember, with these mixtures, kind of the point is that you want to have diverse goals if you're going for a mixture. So cover crops can do a lot of things. Maybe your goal is to alleviate compaction, maybe fix nitrogen, suppress weeds. Maybe you want to get a forage cutting off your animals. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to focus on the goals of reducing nitrogen leaching and reducing erosion and runoff. So let's say that those are the key goals that we have in mind because we're in the Lake Erie watershed, or really anywhere across the country, but especially the upper Midwest to Chesapeake Bay. There's going to be a lot of concern about both of those things. So if those are your goals, now you need to pick cover crop species that can help meet these goals. And what you want to start by thinking about is, what are the characteristics of those cover crops that will help meet the goals? And for reducing nitrogen leaching, and I want to say Tom was speaking mostly about phosphorus. Our results are mostly about nitrogen. I can certainly get into a discussion at the end about phosphorus, which some of the things are similar, but the two nutrients behave pretty differently. So I just want to be clear that I'm going to be mostly focusing on nitrogen here. But if your goal is to reduce nitrogen leaching, you want to maintain living roots. Those roots will be in the soil, taking up nitrogen. Your soil is constantly churning out nitrogen. Anytime it's at all warm, those microbes are breaking down organic matter. It's kind of a constant nitrogen generator. And so you need a living root in there to be taking up that nitrogen, or it's liable to leaching. Now, as far as which living roots, non-legumes are best. So the most common ones for that will be grasses and brassicas, but anything that's not a legume is going to have a greater appetite for nitrogen than the legumes do. Of course, legumes do take up soil nitrogen, but they just tend to do it not as aggressively as non-legumes. And then finally, winter hardy is best because you want those living roots out there both in the fall and in the spring. Both are times of the year when you can lose a lot of nitrogen if you don't have the species there growing. So those are the characteristics for reducing nitrogen leaching. And to reduce erosion and runoff, it looks pretty similar. Maybe the main difference is that you want fast ground cover. So you don't want to rely on fall species that take a long time to get going. Even if they're there, even if they've got living roots, you really want the leaves and stems of those species creating a barrier on your soil, protecting the soil, protecting it from raindrops that can dislodge soil particles and start them moving. So the faster you can cover the ground, the better for reducing erosion and runoff. But then it gets back to familiar things, maintaining living roots, again, for some of the same reasons as before. Those roots will hold the soil in place. And then again, winter hardy is best. So the more cover crop you have growing in the spring, the better coverage you're going to have on the soil, and the better you're going to be doing at holding it in place. I will say that it's possible some cover crops that die over the winter can leave quite a bit of residue behind, and that residue can be there on the soil, and that can also do a decent job reducing erosion. But nothing beats a growing, living cover crop. So you might think that we have this similar set of characteristics for nitrogen retention and erosion control, and so things are relatively simple. But you have to remember this nitrogen management trade-off that we face between reducing leaching and supplying nitrogen to the cash crop. So in the work that I've done out here, we've really relied on our cover crops to supply nitrogen. And I know that in most cases, that's really not going to be how it is. Either you've got access to a large amount of manure, or you're in a system amply supplied with mineral nitrogen. But there can still be benefits to shifting some of that nitrogen supply over to the cover crop, not the least of which is that farmers can save money that way. So we need to think about this trade-off, and we also just need to be cognizant that what we do with our cover crop can affect the amount of nitrogen that the next cash crop is going to see. So not to beat you over the head with really simple stuff, I'm sure everyone is aware, but just really quickly, we have this important distinction between different types of species as far as nitrogen acquisition. So grasses and brassicas and pretty much every type of plant except legumes are only going to acquire nitrogen from the soil. They need the nitrogen to be in soil solution, and their roots will absorb it. On the other hand, legumes can acquire nitrogen from the atmosphere through nitrogen fixation. They have these nodules on their roots full of bacteria, and they can fix that nitrogen. Again, legumes will take up nitrogen from the soil, but they have this ability to acquire it from the air as well. So that really reduces their demand on the soil nitrogen, makes them less effective at soaking up that extra nitrogen, and because they have this great nitrogen source, their biomass tends to be very high in nitrogen relative to the amount of carbon. So that has an impact on nitrogen supply to the next crop. And to illustrate that, here I'm showing results from some work that Charlie did where he grew different cover crops, spray killed them, and then no-tilled corn into the residue. And at this point, these pictures you're seeing, there's been no additional fertility added. So on the left, the fava bean, which is a legume, produces a lot of biomass. You can see that corn is much taller and greener than on the right, the corn following the sorghum Sudan grass residues. And this really illustrates the difference of when microbes are breaking down legume biomass versus when they're breaking down a grass, because there's much more nitrogen in the legumes relative to the amount of carbon. Just another illustration, same study. You can see in the back the red clover, where there had been red clover residues. The corn is doing much better than in the front with the ryegrass. So we have this trade-off between legumes and non-legumes, both between when they take up nitrogen and then what happens when those residues are incorporated into the soil. Another key set of species characteristics is the growth period, or the phenology, when they grow, and a big one is whether they're winter hardy. So cereal rye and canola are examples of winter hardy cover crops, and they'll give you that long-term soil coverage from the fall over winter into the spring. And that gives you the living roots, it gives you the soil cover, and it kind of maximizes what you can achieve as far as reducing nitrogen leaching and controlling erosion with your cover crop. But come springtime, you have a large amount of biomass and you have to do something with it. Cut it for forage, spray it, till it in, roll it down, whatever your system is, you need to take some kind of an action to manage that. A little bit simpler option is with winter killed cover crops. So these oats and radish, for instance, they'll die over the winter, and you at least don't have to kill them in the spring. The radish breaks down so much you probably don't need to worry about managing that residue at all. So that can be a benefit. It's simpler. But there's also, if you go back to the species characteristics that we're looking for, there's not much soil coverage there. It's definitely, that soil's vulnerable to erosion. And there are not living roots, and you've got all this pretty fresh biomass from the radish that's quickly breaking down, so you can end up losing a lot of that nitrogen. On the left-hand side with the oats, you don't have living roots, you can lose nitrogen, but at least you have a serious amount of residue there that can help protect the soil from erosion. So the key characteristics to think about, at least as far as nitrogen retention and erosion control, are how these species take up nitrogen, what happens when those species break down, and then the growth period of those different species. Okay, step 3 in the process of putting together your mix is to choose a seeding rate that accounts for species interactions and farm context. So to illustrate how this works, I want to walk through some results from our research experiment here in Pennsylvania. This is a picture of it here. You can see that in some years at least we got good canola flowers in the spring, and those plots were crawling with bees. So that was pretty cool to see, and lots of other beneficials really like that as well. Our context is that we're growing a corn, soy, wheat rotation for organic feed and forage. And before you all jump off the webinar because I said the word organic, I know that that's not the system that most people are working in, but I think a lot of these results are very universal, and we can learn a lot from these results that can be applied across the board. But that is one piece of context. Our system was fertilized with dairy bed pack manure, and we kind of fertilized it at a rate that was more of a phosphorus rate. So if you know your manure nutrient management, you'll know that we weren't maxing out nitrogen, and that will come into the story a little later on. The other part of this context that's important is we're in a 3-crop rotation where we have the winter cereal, and I know that's something that a lot of farms in the Midwest don't have the luxury of in terms of cover cropping, but it really makes a big difference. We planted the same mixtures in this window that I'm highlighting here in red, following cover crops going into corn silage. That basically the same mixtures were planted after the corn silage going into soybean with a few tweaks. And what we found is that the mixtures that were planted after corn silage, which went in late September, very end of September, we really didn't get much in terms of diversity. These mixtures that I'll be talking about mostly went in mid-August. We had great survival of all the species, and just go a little over a month and a half later, and you didn't get much in terms of diversity. So that's, again, thinking about the planting window that you have, and that's where some of the new technologies for aerial seeding, interseeding, high boy seeding may have some promise for giving us a greater ability to achieve diversity. But just so that you have the right frame of mind to understand what I'm talking about, all the cover crops I'm speaking about today were planted after winter wheat, and then we went into corn silage the next year. So what we did to set up our experiment is that we started with 6 core species. We had 2 legumes, red clover and Austrian winter pea, 2 brassicas, canola and forage radish, and 2 grasses, cereal rye and oats. And the 3 across the top are very reliably winter hardy as long as they can get established a little bit in the fall. And the 3 across the bottom are not. So radish and oats in our climate here in Pennsylvania will die every year. Austrian winter pea is a little bit more hit or miss. If it gets too mature in the fall, or if it doesn't get established enough, it won't make it. But if it's the right level of maturity in the fall, we did have it over winter sometimes. And I've included the seeding rates and costs here to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're working with. But I want to put out a big caveat. Those costs are probably striking you as pretty darn high, and these are conventional seed costs, not organic seed costs, so that's not the reason. The reason is that these are pretty high seeding rates. We were working, we were really trying to understand the effects of cover crops. We wanted to have a lot of cover crop biomass out there to have them do their thing. So we ended up with probably higher seeding rates than what most farmers would do. 100 pounds of oats is probably more than you need to get the benefits of oats. But I just wanted to put that out there so that people aren't scared away by the seed rate costs, that I've got on the slide here. And I also want to say that these are high enough that I wouldn't say, okay, go home and go ahead and plant 100 pound of oats. to the acre, that's probably more than you need, and you can get away with a lower rate. And we'll talk more at the end about how to exactly choose the best rate for you. But anyway, we started with these 6 core species, and then what we did is try to make 4 functional mixtures that would do specific things for us. So the first one is a 3-species nitrogen management mix. Again, this was going into corn, so we wanted to get a mixture that would supply a lot of nitrogen to the corn. And what we did there is we just cut the winter pea seeding rate in half, we cut the red clover rate in half, and then we did a quarter rate, or maybe about 20% of cereal rye. So that was a big cut on the cereal rye relative to the legumes, to try to get the amount of nitrogen from those legumes that we wanted. We also did a 3-species weed management mix, where we did a half rate of oats, a half rate of rye, and a half rate of red clover, thinking that that red clover might help out the 2 grasses, might help out the following corn crop. Again, we have 2 things going on here. We had high seeding rates, and we're overseeding in the sense that we're doing in our mixtures more than 100% of the monoculture. I think I might have lost audio there for a second. So again, there's an opportunity to get the cover crops out there without so much cost. The last 2 functional mixtures, we have a 4-species mixture. The main goal here was to add in canola, and that was because, as I showed earlier, canola produces a huge amount of flowers in the spring when it has time to reach that maturity, and we wanted to see what the effects would be on beneficial insects. And then finally, we have a mixture with all 6 species, and this is kind of the insurance mix. If one of your grasses performs poorly, maybe the other one will fill in. If you get a bad seed lot of red clover, maybe the winter pea will do the job. So this is all 6 species mixed together, and they're all at a kind of a cut rate from their original seeding rate. All right, so how did these different mixtures pan out in terms of the 2 functions that we're focused on, which are reducing nitrogen losses and reducing erosion? Well, first let's talk about the biomass. And what we saw was that in the fall, we had pretty low biomass production by the clover, but quite a lot by the pea. And I'll just put it out there that I would not recommend planting red clover in August. In this scenario, it's not suited to that. It's best suited to kind of a frost seeding scenario. And that time of year, it doesn't establish well and leaves a lot of soil uncovered by virtue of just growing too slow. But the pea, even though it can kind of go off to a slow start, it really likes the cool weather in the fall and will keep on going and produce a lot of biomass. Canola and radish, both very effective, reliable at producing biomass, as well as rye and oat. You can see that oat is really the star. This was spring oat, and it just races towards maturity there in the fall, where the rye, of course, tillers and then waits to vernalize over the winter before it really jumps up. But what we saw that was encouraging was that our mixture biomass was pretty even. Every species we planted was represented. Red clover, of course, was kind of barely there, but it was there. And in the 3-species nitrogen, you had a good mix of pea and rye, all the way over to the 6-species mixture, where all of the species were represented with some amount of evenness. So going back to the original notion of mixtures giving you diverse benefits, we can see here that we really have an opportunity to see that pan out. We have all the biomass there, the species are doing different things, and we have the opportunity to get those diverse benefits. One problem we saw, though, is that cereal rye really dominated in the spring. So the first thing to notice about the spring data is that the pea, radish, and oats are all gone. I'm only showing 1 year of data here for simplicity, and this is a year where the pea did not survive, on its own at least. Those are gone. Canola didn't do great, but the clover is doing a little better, and of course rye, old reliable, has quite a bit of biomass. This was harvested, or this was all terminated about when the rye was in the boot stage. And we see a similar effect in the mixtures, where rye is just very dominant. There's a little bit of red clover, maybe a little bit of canola, but that rye comes on so hard in the spring, it does so well over winter that we got a lot of dominance. And so the story from the fall that we got this nice diverse mixture of biomass and should be getting a nice balanced set of benefits looks a little different when you get to the spring. And I think this tells you that as you experiment with cover crop mixtures, you have to think about how species interact across time. It might be a different story in the fall than in the spring, so you need to get out there, take a look at it, see what's happening, and see how things are changing. This is just a picture to illustrate that cereal rye dominance. This was a 6-species mixture. You can see all the oat straw there that's left over from the fall, so there had been a lot of oats. And you can see some clover leaves in there, but pretty much what we've got is dominance by the cereal rye, even though we planted 6 species in the fall. Here's another illustration of how that mixture composition can change over time. We are tracking this 4-species mixture from the same study over time from planting to spring biomass. And you can see that just between planting and emergence, we see quite a big shift. Red clover is starting to fall behind, rye is doing well. And then as we go throughout the fall, a huge shift again. Like I've said many times now, red clover underperforms. Pea does a great job in the fall. The rye and canola both hang on. So you end up at the end of the fall with a pretty diverse set of biomass. You've got a grass, a brassica, and a legume all doing well. Then winter hits, you pretty much lose the pea, and rye vernalizes and just takes off like crazy. So this is just an illustration of how dynamic these cover crop mixtures can be over time, where if you plant out a certain mix based on the seeds in the seed lot, that's very much not guaranteed to be what you get in the fall, and what you get in the fall might not be what you get in the spring. So you really have to work with these individual species, figure out how they respond on your farm, how they interact with each other to get the kind of biomass mix that you want. Okay, so we talked about biomass. Let's talk about fall ground cover. This is one of those key characteristics for reducing erosion. You can see that pretty much across the board, with the exception of clover, we're getting a good amount of fall ground cover. These readings were taken in October, and because they might combine an upright species like an oat with a more prostrate species, either a broadleaf like canola or radish or pea, or rye in the fall actually stays pretty close to the ground while it's just tillering out. So you can see that the mixtures aren't blowing the monocultures out of the water, but they're holding their own as far as fall ground cover. And just to give you some images to illustrate how this looked in the field, this is probably our strongest stand of fall radish that we got across the years of the study. And that's just doing a fantastic job covering the soil. Again, a mixture in the fall, doing a great job, but the red clover lagging behind. There's a lot of soil there that's exposed. There are living roots across most of that soil, but if you get a hard rainstorm, a lot of soil is going to move. So that's something to watch out for. Going into the spring, we see some changes. So again, the radish and the oat are goners. This data includes a year where the pea overwintered a bit, but it's still pretty low. And then you get clover. Clover likes that cool spring weather a little bit better, so it's doing better, but still not as good as rye. And we have rye only at 50%. Now that's a little bit misleading, and I'll explain that in a second. But first I want to show the mixtures. If you remember the biomass, those mixtures were pretty much just rye, so it's not too surprising that they line out. Just got a little notice about the audio again, so I'll say that again. Rye bolts quickly in the spring, becomes very upright. So even though there's a ton of biomass out there and this cover crop stand is doing a great job of controlling erosion, it kind of gets deflated a little bit. It's lower. It kind of comes out lower than it really is. So the numbers I just showed you, I think, should give you confidence that both the rye and the mixtures are certainly doing a great job controlling erosion. Now, to illustrate some of the other ways that this can go, here's spring radish. Again, those radish plants disintegrate rapidly and leave the soil pretty vulnerable to erosion as well as nitrogen leaching. And then spring oats, all that biomass that grew in the fall, all that straw is there, and it's actually going to do a pretty good job controlling erosion just from a residue perspective. All right, so we've talked about the different species and the mixtures and how they turned out as far as controlling erosion. What about nitrogen retention? So on the left side of this graph, we have nitrate leaching below 12 inches. And the units here are pounds of nitrogen per acre. So you can really relate that directly to the nitrogen that you might apply or the farmers you work with might apply as far as fertilizers that they've bought. And you can see there's a huge range from losing about 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, maybe half what you need for your corn crop on highly productive soils, all the way to losing almost nothing there on the right. And you can kind of make sense of this graph if you break it down into different types of treatments. On the left, you've got either no cover crop, so our fallow control, which we did till lightly to control weeds, and then the clover, which is a legume, so it's got a low appetite for nitrogen and it grew slowly. So for both of those, you can see that you're losing just a huge amount of nitrate at the bottom of the soil profile. Now the next group, not as bad, but still a lot more nitrogen that you'd like to lose, either from a financial perspective as a farmer, or certainly from an environmental perspective in terms of water quality, are species that are winter killed. So you've got the oat and the radish, and those the fast-growing legume, the pea. So pea does better than clover. It's more voracious in terms of taking up nitrogen just because it's putting on more biomass, but it's still a legume, and it's still just not as good as the grasses. The ones that worked really well were the treatments that included a winter hardy grass or a brassica. And we see canola and rye, the winter hardy grass and brassica monocultures in there, doing really well. And we can see that all of our mixtures did an excellent job at retaining nitrogen. And if you think back to the earlier slides when I told you what the seeding rates were on those mixtures, you can remember that we cut the seeding rate pretty hard. So for instance, in this 3-species nitrogen mix here, that's only got a 20% seeding rate of rye compared to what it was here in monoculture, and it's got legumes in there that are producing a lot of nitrogen and that are breaking down. So especially the pea after it winter kills. So despite having that very low rate of the winter hardy grass, we still got really significant reduction in nitrate losses as compared to not having any cover crops out there at all. So I think that that's a hopeful story where you can have a functional mix that has a relatively low seeding rate of aggressive grass or brassica, and then you can fill in the rest of the mix with other species to get other functions. So some take-homes so far. One is that mixtures can give you diverse benefits, and that may be one of the main reasons to go with mixtures. Second is that mixture composition will change over time. So you have to think about the benefits that you want and when you're going to get them. Think about how species perform in the fall and the spring, and how they're going to compete with each other if you want to really understand the benefits you're getting from the mixture. You need at least one fast-growing winter hardy species to get the benefits that we need or that we want here of nitrogen retention and of erosion control, at least one. But you can do it with a low seeding rate and still get sufficient cover. So kind of the 20% rule, if you know what a monoculture rate is, that's going to give you a full stand of one of these aggressive species, 20% of that may be enough to really reduce leaching and prevent erosion. Finally, we have this challenge where we need to balance nitrogen retention and nitrogen supply, and that's what I'm going to be getting in a little bit in the next section here. We all, maybe some of you remember, I'm actually just barely old enough to know what this is. When WYSIWYG came in computing, and you could just easily print something off and know that it would look like what you had on your screen. Well, my question is, what happens with cover crop mixtures? Is what you plant what you get. And I'm guessing you all know the answer at this point, but we've seen really profound effects of different farms and how the same mixture planted at a low nitrogen level can look really different from that mix planted at a high nitrogen level. So we, in addition to our research station, we planted the same 4-species mix on 3 collaborating farms, 3 farmers' places, and we saw some really fascinating results. So the way we made sense of this is first by looking at which places had a shorter season in the fall and a longer season in the fall, and this is just based on the geography and the management of the cash crops. So growing degree days in the fall, whether they were low or high. And what we saw is that where there was a short season, the cereal rye dominated this mix. So that's probably because of the, well, just pause for a second, dominated in short season. On the longer season, the canola dominated. And the difference there is probably because the cereal rye has to vernalize before it can really take off, and the canola doesn't. It's a very aggressive species, and where the season is short, it can tiller and kind of max out its own growth, where the canola is a little bit slower to come on. But where there's a longer fall season, once the cereal rye kind of parks itself and waits for vernalization, the canola just keeps on going, and you end up with total canola dominance. So that's one dynamic that we saw of the same 4-species mixture varying by farm. Another one was nitrogen level. So in the 2 farms that had a low or a moderate level of nitrogen in the soil, we actually got a decent amount of legume production, mostly the winter pea. But in the 2 farms that had a large amount of nitrogen in the soil, and these were places that had access to ample manure supplies or ample compost supplies, and they applied it every year, in those farms we saw almost no legume production at all. So this was just really kind of fascinating to us that the same mix planted on 4 different farms, all within the state of Pennsylvania, all within organic farms, all following a small grain, ended up with such a wide range of different biomass production. So what we're doing now is kind of the next phase of this project is that we are trying to figure out how to, quote, farm tune these cover crop mixes. So we've expanded our geographic reach even further. We've got farmers in New York, Western PA, down to Southeastern PA. We cover a lot of different hardiness zones and season length there, and also across all these farms, the soils differ a lot. And we're going to try to figure out more precisely how to really target your mixture or farm tune your mixture so that you get the kind of biomass that you want. But you know, using the 4 farms that we have, we already have some ability to get into this trade-off between reducing nitrogen leaching and supplying nitrogen to the cash crop. So this slide is a little bit complicated. I'm going to walk through it and try to have it make sense to you. This is some of Charlie's work that I'm trying to summarize for you guys. But I think it's really important, and this is cutting edge of understanding how cover crops work, how cover crop mixtures work for managing nitrogen. So some basic relationships that should be really clear to everybody is that if you have higher soil organic matter, you're going to get more nitrogen supplied to the corn. So that organic matter, it contains both carbon and nitrogen. As the microbes break it down, oftentimes a lot of that nitrogen will be released and be made available to the corn. Okay, so that's a pretty basic one. The next one, probably even more basic, is that if you have a lot of nitrate in your soil in the fall, you're going to have higher nitrate leaching. It just makes sense. If the nitrate's there, you get rains, water moves through the soil, the nitrate's going to move, you get higher leaching. And the thing to notice about these 2 variables on the left, these soil variables, organic matter and fall nitrate, is that they can both be measured really easily. You go out to your field that you're going to plant a cover crop on in the fall before you put it in, you pull a few soil samples, send them into a lab, and now you have a lot of information that can tell you what's going to happen both with nitrogen supply and with nitrate leaching. So this is like a really advanced, exciting technique for people who just, you know, they want to manage these cover crops to a T. They want to get the exact benefits that they're looking for, and they're going to use all the tools at their disposal. Going out and getting a soil sample before you plant your cover crops will just be a major benefit to farm tune those cover crops to exactly what you want. And so we've got soil organic matter increasing nitrogen supply, fall soil nitrate increasing leaching, but then there's other factors as well from the cover crop that are going to impact nitrogen supply and leaching. So not surprisingly, the more spring biomass nitrogen that you have, so if you've got a huge amount of red clover that did well over the winter, or crimson clover, if your pea overwintered and does well in the spring, the more biomass nitrogen you have in the spring, the more N supply you're going to have to your corn. Something that may not be as obvious is that you can also reduce the nitrogen supply to your corn. So that's the next two boxes. If you have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio in your cover crop biomass, you can tie up the nitrogen and reduce the supply to your corn. And the types of species where you're going to get a high carbon to nitrogen ratio are those grasses and brassicas, the ones that aren't fixing nitrogen. And that ratio is going to get higher the more mature those species become. So you can play around with both your cover crop seeding rate and your management as far as how mature it gets to really affect the nitrogen supply to your corn. That nitrogen supply is going to be highest where you have a lot of biomass in your spring cover crop biomass, a lot of nitrogen in that biomass, and where the carbon to nitrogen ratio isn't too high. So where you avoid really mature grasses and brassicas. Now finally, this nitrate leaching piece is also affected directly by the non-legume seeding rate. So the more non-legumes you have, the more grasses, the more brassicas, the less nitrate leaching you're going to see. And we've talked about that quite a bit. What's interesting is that you also have an interaction here between the non-legume seeding rate and the fall and spring biomass carbon to nitrogen ratio. So we're getting back to that trade-off between nitrogen retention and nitrogen leaching. And Charlie has developed some rules of thumb to take the results of the fall soil sample for organic matter and nitrate and translate them into how do you tweak your cover crop seeding rate to get things just right. I'm not going to go through those because it gets pretty complicated, but if people specifically want to get into that, it is something we can talk about in the Q&A. So some more take-homes from this section. Mixtures respond really strongly to the farm context, both soil fertility and climate. Simple soil tests, if you really want to get good at this cover crop management, a soil test can help you tailor mixtures to both reduce nitrogen leaching and to optimize nitrogen supply to the corn. So the really simple rules, if you've got a lot of fall nitrate and you want to reduce leaching, you have to put fewer legumes in your mix. And if you've got a lot of organic matter and you want to reduce leaching, you have to put fewer legumes. The flip side is if you can manage your cash crop over the summer to have low fall nitrate, so your leaching loss or your leaching risk is low, then you can get more legumes in your mix, and that can do more to supply nitrogen to your corn. I know it's getting complicated, that's why I didn't go into the rules of thumb, but maybe I'm sparking some ideas there on the other end of the webinar, and I think this shows that there's still a lot to be learned about managing nutrients and nitrogen with cover crops, and that there's a lot, we've got a lot of scope for improvement. Just a few last details as far as establishment that I want to go through before we get to the Q&A. So how do you find the right seeding rates? It's tricky. Things shift over time. They shift farm to farm. So what you want to do is start with an educated guess, plant a small acreage so that you're not out too much if it goes poorly. Observe the results and be sure to see it a couple of times in the fall, a couple of times in the spring, because they're dynamic, and then you want to adjust as needed. Where would you get started? I would say your neighbor, a local farmer who's been, this would be a great place. You can get prepackaged seed mixes from a lot of different cover crop seed companies, but just don't expect them to behave exactly the way they say, because every farm, every context is different. There's also seed rate calculators out there. Green Cover Seeds has one called Smart Mix. I haven't used it, but I understand it's got a lot of capability. And then we have this fact sheet that I touched on earlier that has this nice table in the back where you can go through, look at different, and my audio flip for a second, that will give you specific recommendations for species that will work in your planting window. Finally, some more just final establishment details. If you want to just do a simple grass legume mix, you really have to dial back the grass seeding rate, keep it between 1/2 and 1/4 of the monoculture rate for the grass. And if you really want to get a lot of legume production, you should even think about doing 20% of the monoculture rate of the grass while keeping the legumes near their full rate. So you really just need to overseed the legumes relative to the grass if you want to get a more even mix in terms of biomass. And then just in general, putting together mixes, you need to limit the seeding rates for highly competitive species like radish, canola, sorghum sudan grass, oats, rye. These all at different times of the year have the ability to take over a mix, and then there goes the diversity that you've been shooting for. Okay, that's all I have for you today. I know I went relatively fast, but I think we're finishing about on time with some time for questions. So I just want to say thanks, and here's contact information both for me and for Charlie if you want to, if you have more questions and want to get in touch with us. But for now, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mitch. You've done a wonderful job, and I think we all appreciate the valuable information that you've shared with us today. So let's begin the Q&A. I do have a couple of questions to get us going, and feel free if you have any questions to put them in the question box. Here's the first question. I've seen where a neighbor of mine used a mix of 15 different species of cover crops. Is there really a benefit to each and every one? Wouldn't it be less expensive just to use a few for the same result?
That is a great question. I actually had a slide addressing that, but just needed to cut it for length. Yeah, there are a lot of farmers out there who are doing really diverse cover crop mixes, and I would never say anything against that because I think that is getting people excited. And there's nothing more valuable than having people get excited to experiment with something new. So these crazy diverse mixes are great. And I think in some cases, certainly if you have livestock, you can imagine some real benefits nutritionally from having that diverse forage source. And I know a lot of the farmers, especially the pioneers like Gabe Brown, do have livestock, and so that system works really, really well. But you don't want all that excitement and experimentation to end with failure and a big expense that maybe turns somebody off. And so I think it is true that you can get a lot of benefits from just a couple of species. Actually, if you go back to my early slides, even a single species gives you a range of benefits that you have to balance. So all cover crops are multifunctional. They do multiple things, and they often do one or two things really well. So if you just want to do those one or two things, you might only need one species, maybe two. If you're looking to get a more diverse suite of benefits, I think it's worth it to think about a mixture. And I also want to say the science on this is still evolving. We don't know yet that there's any particular magic for soil microbes or soil health or building carbon or anything like that from having a big diversity of cover crop species. But there's still a lot of room for discovery, and we may find out that just diversity in its own right is a benefit. So what I would say is don't go crazy. Don't stay up late at night trying to figure out how to get 5 more species into your mix. If you pick 3 or 4 that are going to give you the benefits that you want, that's a great place to start.
Okay, great. So we have a question. Somebody said, what about slugs? Here in southern Illinois, we have had a terrible slug outbreak and many acres replanted because of it. So I think they're asking if there are mixtures that could reduce slug issues.
That is a great question, and I haven't researched slugs directly, but luckily I have some colleagues here at Penn State who have done a lot of work on slugs. So I can give you a little bit of a download of what they've found. If this is a passion for you and you need more, the people to contact are John Tooker. He's an extension specialist here, and his grad student Maggie Douglas. If you want their contact info, you can Google it or email me. I think, yeah, there's a couple interesting things going on with slugs. So it really depends on management, and I'm guessing that those slug outbreaks are biggest or most problematic in no-till acres. Tillage is pretty effective at controlling slugs, but if you've moved away from tillage, which is often a very good thing, then you might be in a situation where slugs can be a problem, and having cover crop residues on the surface keeps it moist, keeps the slug habitat really nice. What we've seen out here is there's a small but growing group of farmers who are getting pretty aggressive about planting their cash crops into a growing cover crop. And they pretty much plant and spray on the same day. The practice is referred to as planting green because you're planting right into a green cover crop. And in those scenarios, there's some kind of preliminary results that show having all that other living biomass there lets the crops get started, get out of the ground, and kind of get away from the slugs. So the slugs are essentially distracted by all the other biomass that's out there. It's not, it's not tested to the point of being surefire at this point, but there's a lot of promise. I do recognize that planting into green living cover crops is a bit of a departure for a lot of farmers, and I understand that that might not be something you want to just rush out and do. So otherwise, if you're dealing with quite a bit of cover crop residue on the soil, and you've got an issue with too much slug habitat and therefore too many slugs, it's a tricky situation. There's really not much as far as slug control products that are very helpful. One other piece of one other result from out here, though, which is intriguing, is there seems to be a feedback between the use of seed treatments, insecticidal seed treatments, and slug problems. So it's a little bit complicated, but basically the slugs eat the seeds, and they get the insecticide. It doesn't actually hurt the slugs because they're mollusks, they're not insects, but then their predators, like ground beetles, will eat the slugs, and the insecticides pass through the slugs, go into the ground beetles, and all of a sudden you get a major drop-off of slug predators. So you kind of have this cascading effect. The insecticidal seed treatment reduces the predators on the slugs and then lets those slug populations explode. Again, lots of folks are really dedicated to using those insecticidal seed treatments, but John Tooker feels confident enough in these results on research stations and on farms to recommend that farmers at least are very, very careful about choosing to include those treatments. Make sure that there's an actual insect that's likely to be a pest that you need to exclude with those seed treatments before you use them, or you might have this strong unintended consequence of actually making your slug problem worse. Now, of course, going to a seed dealer and requesting seed that's not treated with insecticide, that's gotten a lot harder. So this is an emerging challenge, and I think it's one where we need to develop some more flexibility in our management to get around, both the slug habitat thing and the kind of the ecological side of things, where we might be doing some harm to the very insects that could help control those slugs.
Okay. I think we have time for one last quick question. How about this one? Which two cover crops would give you the most bang for your buck to improve soil health?
Yeah, that's a good question. Soil health to me is all about carbon, and soil health is a critical goal. It can get complicated. There's a lot of tests that you can do, but it's really all about carbon, getting carbon into the soil. What I'm going to say is there's not one or two species that are most beneficial for soil health. It's going to come down a lot to how they're managed. And if your goal is to get a lot of carbon in the soil, you want biomass, you want root biomass and above ground biomass, and you want to keep that soil covered for as long as possible, because uncovered soil is vulnerable to that carbon being burned off, and you also want to reduce tillage. So the longer you have a living cover crop on there, that means you're producing biomass, carbon is being pumped into the soil, and it's not being tilled for that window. So rather than pointing out two specific species, I think it comes down to a lot how they're managed, and you got to manage them to produce biomass and to cover the soil. So to not totally cop out on recommendations, the ones that come to mind that are likely to work to produce biomass and keep the soil covered, always going to be a winter hardy cereal grain, rye, wheat, that kind of thing, triticale. And then if you can get a legume in the mix as well, it doesn't hurt to prime the pump as far as the soil microbes with some nitrogen as well. That's a little trickier in terms of the planting windows that we have to work with, but I would start with a cereal grain. That's going to be a good carbon pump, and then if you can figure out a way to get some legume biomass in there as well, that's a great complement.
Great. Well, in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A, and I want to thank Mitch for joining us today. We really appreciate him taking the time to share his work. So at this time, I want to recognize our participating ag retailers. If you're an ag retailer in the Great Lakes Basin that is interested in participating in this partnership to benefit your business and water quality, please contact me. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge our funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible, in particular the support of the Great Lakes Protection Fund and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. As we wrap up, please remember to look for the email later this afternoon with a webinar evaluation, webinar recording, and a link to submit your CCA credentials to earn the 1.5 CCA CEUs, if you've not already done so. I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you join us again for our next webinar in July.